Hi, my name's Dr. James Johnson, and thank you for joining us for another lesson. When we look at our lives, a lot of times we have seasons, things that kind of come and go, and we can get a little nostalgic for the good old days. As a child of the 80s, I remember a lot of things that we used to have around that are gone. Movie rental places, some restaurants, channels on the television that require antennas to pick up the idea of Saturday morning cartoons. Those are things that aren't around anymore. They've been replaced with new things and new seasons that we don't need movie rental places anymore. We can stream online pretty much any movie anytime. There's no going into the store and hoping that the copies of the movie you want to rent haven't all been rented out, that we don't have to worry about Saturday morning cartoons because they're streaming all the time. That a lot of these things that they're just not around anymore. And even if they've been replaced with something different that's better, there's a part of us that still longs for the things of the past, the things that are gone, the things that we've lost. And as we recognize there are things in our life that we lose, maybe we lose a loved one or a possession or even our autonomy, that as we lose things in life, we have a vacuum of part of our life that used to be there that is now gone. And for many of us, we can't fill that void without accepting and processing the loss. And the way we do that is a process called grief. And that's what we're going to look at in this lesson is grief. Now, as you can tell from the image I've got on this title slide is my boy Charlie Brown. And if you grew up watching the Charlie Brown Peanuts cartoons or reading the Peanuts comic strip, you know that Charlie Brown's catchphrase is good grief. And I love that phrase not just because it's a little nostalgic, but also because it's an oxymoron. When I used to teach English, I loved teaching different parts of grammar and syntax and literary functions. And oxymorons are two words that are put together to form a different concept, like jumbo shrimp. Those are two opposites, but they sound fun when we put them together. They make something different. And so when we talk about this idea of good grief, that sounds like an oxymoron. It sounds paradoxical, because how in the world can grief be good? But we have to recognize that grief is the process God has given us to help us make a space in our lives for the new to come. That's actually the goal of grief. The goal of grief is to make peace with the past in order to clear out space in our mind, body, and spirit for what can be in the present. There's so many times where I meet people who years, sometimes even decades later, are unable to move forward in their life because they have not processed the things they've lost or the people they've lost in a healthy way. And their grief is stunted because they refuse to go through the process, and because that grief never actually takes place, there's no room in their life for something healthy and new and beautiful to replace it. And so as we go through this process, we're going to look at how can we grieve in a healthy way. What things can we do to prevent unhealthy or stunted grieving? And how can we actually go through the process with a recognition of this goal? Now, if you're a note taker and you want this presentation, of course, you got this video that you can share, but you can also email me if you have questions or anything that you'd like, maybe a copy of the PowerPoint or something like that. I'm always glad to share. My email is jjohnson@honeylakeclinic.com. jjohnson@honeylakeclinic.com. Now, I'm a movie guy. I love movies. I love books. I love stories. I taught high school English for a long time and just really am fascinated with narratives because I feel like we connect to them well. It's interesting to me that many people can't necessarily quote Bible verses. They can't tell you exactly where certain things in the Bible are, but what they can remember are the narratives in the Bible. They can tell you the stories or the descriptions. This is why Jesus, as the master teacher, taught in parables, because people would remember them, because we connect with stories and plot lines. And in a movie that I've used a lot in the past with people I've worked with in pastoral care and pastoral ministry is a movie Inside Out. And in the Disney movie Inside Out, there is a character, Riley, who is the main focus of the story, but inside her mind, we get to see her emotions, which are also characterized. We get to see emotions that are personified as joy, sadness, fear, disgust, and anger. And there's a lot of things I love about this movie, but one of the things I love most is that it normalizes having multiple emotions that we experience. In our society, happiness is the emotion that is celebrated. Happiness is the emotion that we long for, that we expect to happen every single moment of every single day. And if we are unhappy or we are experiencing a different emotion besides happiness, we feel like there's something wrong and we need to do something to fix it to feel happy again. As a result, we end up substituting healthy emotional awareness and emotional regulation with substituting it with substances or experiences that make us feel artificially happy or bring artificial pleasure that isn't lasting. And as a result of this only trying to experience happiness and trying to not experience any other emotion, we can miss out on so many healthy opportunities to grow and experience life. And as Riley, the character in this story, is moving from her childhood into her adolescent years, she is having to process that. And during the story, this is symbolized by the emotions of happiness. And in this movie, they call it her joy, but I call it happiness because in the Christian faith, happiness is the emotion, but joy is the choice that we all have to look for the good things, to be thankful even in difficult and trying times. So I think of it as emotion, even though the emotion of happiness, even though her name in the movie is Joy. And so joy and sadness end up getting lost from the headquarters of Riley's mind. And that's a beautiful way of looking at this time of adolescence as almost sometimes feeling all these other emotions stronger. Anger, jealousy, and fear are hyper, they're exaggerated. They are more present and prevalent in the adolescent mind as they're going through the process of building identity. But man, these other two emotions need to be brought back to play to help us on our life journey. And as this process in the movie of joy and sadness working their way back to the headquarters, which is in Riley's mind, they go on a lot of adventures. Along the way, they meet a character you can see on this slide, this weird elephant slash cat slash cotton candy creature who is Riley's imaginary friend. And I don't know if you had an imaginary friend growing up, and if you do, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But like most children that have imaginary friends, as we move into adolescence, we move past that and we tend to forget our imaginary friend. It kind of just drifts away to the back of our mind, and sometimes we just forget about it altogether. Well, Bing Bong, this character, is Riley's imaginary friend. And as she is transitioning into adolescence, Bing Bong recognizes he's being forgotten. And there's a scene in the movie where as he is recognizing and accepting his own disappearance, his own death, so to speak, he has to grieve the loss that Riley is forgetting about him, all the journeys and adventures that they had, all the dreams that he had of her playing with him and the expectations of what they were going to do. They're now lost. They're gone. And Joy, which we know is happiness, comes up to Bing Bong and tries to make him happy. She makes faces at him. She tries to tickle him, and it doesn't work. He just sits there in silent apathy. But it's only when sadness comes, and we see that in this picture. Sadness comes up to him, and when he experiences sadness, that is when he begins to feel the emotions again. He gets shaken from his apathy, and he begins to process his own death that's coming and make peace with it so he can move into his transition. Sadness was what was needed for him to grieve. And sadness is also what you and I need to grieve as well. And so as we go through the grief process, we recognize that there are stages of grief. And these are the classical, clinical psychological, human growth and development, wherever you were when you learned about these are the 5 stages of grief. And what we used to believe back in the 80s and 90s, the prevalent view in psychology was that grief was a linear process with a start and a finish. That a person would go through the grief process, they would start with denial and isolation, move into anger, transition into bargaining, shift into depression, and finally arrive at acceptance. And once they got to acceptance, they were, ta-da, done with grieving. But what we have recognized in recent decades is that grief is not a one and done process. It is not a race where we have a start and a finish line. Grief is a lifelong process. We are never done grieving. We may shift in and out of the stages, but it never actually is finished and gone and completely done with. We spend the rest of our lives grieving our losses. And what we also recognize is that grief comes in cycles and seasons. I like to compare it to the ocean. I don't know if you're an ocean person. I love going to the beach. And when I go to the beach, one of my favorite things to do is to stick my feet into the water at the edge of the shoreline and feel the waves just lap against my feet. And on a nice calm day, it's just my feet, and maybe up to my knees that gets hit with the waves. But there are times when the tide rolls in, where the waves increase in strength and power. And instead of getting hit up to my feet or ankles or shins, it's up to my knees, my thighs, my waist. And then there are particularly strong times when the tide is rolling out and the undercurrent is dragging us underneath. The riptide is moving us out to sea. The storms are coming and the waves are crashing. And that is like grief. Grief in some seasons of life and some points in our life, it's very gentle. It's there, but it's not extremely violent. It's not extremely noticeable. But then there are other times where it gets stronger and sometimes where it just absolutely drags us under. And that's grief. And so as we transition from these different stages, we recognize that they're not linear. One day we may be in denial, isolation, then we may move into depression, into anger, bargaining, and then to acceptance, and we may stay in acceptance for years. And then a season, an anniversary, a song, a smell, we may have an experience that takes us all back. So what are the 5 stages? Well, I've highlighted them, but let's look at them. Denial and isolation is where we block out words and facts. We deny the reality of the situation. I'll share a personal example to try to help you walk through these with me. One of my favorite people in my lifetime has been my grandmother. She was a second mother to me. I lived on the same farm, our family farm. We all lived on it, and it was very common for me to go spend time with my grandparents at their house on the farm. And my grandmother was always, reliable to have a good joke or a fun story or a snack or a good meal, and I just loved spending time with her. But if we all live long enough, we all transition into old age. And after my grandfather passed away, she lived in the house by herself, and I began to purposefully spend more time with her to help with this. And over time, she passed away as well. And in the latter seasons of her life, she needed to be in an assisted living facility. She began to develop dementia, and she could not stay safely in her home by herself anymore. And so she lived in an assisted living facility with other friends that she had, and it was a beautiful season. But because she lived in the assisted living facility, I only really saw her on Fridays and weekends and things like that. And Friday was just kind of the day that when I got off of work, I would go to the place where she was living and visit with her for the evening. And we'd have dinner together. Well, after she passed away, denial set in for me. That it wasn't something I consciously did. It just, because it was not part of my normal daily life, I just forgot that she had passed away. And I will never forget the first Friday after she had passed away, I came to call on the assisted living facility to make sure she was in a good state for me to come visit. And I had to be reminded by the employees there, the nurses, that she wasn't there anymore. I was in denial. And then after denial, the next stage is anger. Anger may be directed towards the person that we have lost, our family, or even to strangers. So that we have this looming, ever-present anger in our hearts. And we are angry because the emotion of anger tells us something unjust has happened. And it is unjust for us to lose things, for them to be taken away from us. The greatest injustice is death, because we know in our hearts that death is wrong. Whether it's in a hospital, at a funeral, at a bedside, when a person passes away, we recognize it's unnatural. There's a longing in our heart for eternity, to live forever. And so anger comes in, and I remember being angry that when my grandmother passed away, I wasn't there. I'm in the military, and I was gone for military work because it was unexpected, and I wasn't there. And that shifted me into the bargaining stage. The bargaining stage is where we begin to ask the if only questions, statements, the woulda, coulda, shouldas. And I said, if only I hadn't been on military orders. If only I had been home, I could have seen her in her last moments. If only I would have made more time for her. And we play the if only game, the woulda, coulda, shouldas of life. And then the fourth stage is depression. That's where we have sadness and regret. And sadness is the emotion that we have to process and allow ourselves to feel so that we can move into acceptance, where we make peace with ourselves and the situation and the loss. Not everybody reaches acceptance, and not everybody stays in acceptance. It's incredibly common for us to shift in and out as we go through life. There are times where I move from acceptance back to sadness. When our daughters do something and I wish my grandmother was there to see them do it. When I have a memory or I hear a song that reminds me of her, I move out of acceptance back to depression, and sometimes I even go back into bargaining. And I play the woulda, coulda, shoulda game again. It's part of the grief process. So we've talked about the stages, we've talked about the goal, but what is grief? Let's put a definition to it. Grief is the natural, instinctual reaction to the loss of someone or something we hold an attachment to. Grief is experienced differently by each person. And some of the following symptoms could be somatic. That means, it's in our mind that manifests in our body, or bodily distress. We might be angry, we might be sad, we might have sicknesses, we might have chills, we might have muscle soreness. Preoccupation, where our mind constantly ruminates and marinates on that person, that loss, or that experience. We might feel guilt. We might feel like there was something we should have done better, and we blame ourselves for the situation. We might have a hostile reaction, and that might be a strong emotion like anger, or we might have outbursts. We might also go to an extreme. We might go on a shopping spree. This is why when, as a military chaplain, one of my jobs is to be a casualty notification officer, and when a service member passes away, I get called sometimes to go notify the family. And that's a beautifully terrible thing to have to do. But one of the things that happens in the military that on the regular is that the life insurance money of the service member usually ends up being in their loved one's bank account within 48 hours. And so one of the things I have to caution their loved ones when I do that casualty notification, I caution them, don't spend the money except to pay bills and do the emergency, but don't do anything unnecessary with that money for 6 months. Allow yourselves to get past the shock and move into the grief process so you can make wise decisions, because numerous people have received hundreds of thousands of dollars in a couple of days, and they've had a hostile extreme reaction, and they've spent it all, and that's never a good thing. And grief can produce that clouded mindset. And of course, difficulty functioning as one did prior to the loss. When that person that you lose, or that situation changes, and you lose a season, you lose an ability, you lose a connection, your life is never the same. And you may have difficulty functioning the way you used to. I see this a lot in marriages when a spouse passes away. It tends to be on average that usually couples split up responsibilities into the home, and usually one of the spouses is the money person. They do the finances, the investments, the checkbook, the credit cards. They handle all the money stuff. And when that person passes away, the other spouse usually has difficulty handling money, because it could be years or decades since they've had to do it. I see this with people with cooking as well, that one spouse tends to be the cook in the family and the other doesn't normally do it. And it's very common when, especially when a couple has been married for a long period of time, decades, that when the spouse who cooks passes away and the other remains, that they don't know how to feed themselves, really. They don't know how to cook. And so they end up relying on prepackaged or restaurant meals. And so the two things I want to highlight that we have read over on this slide is that grief is natural, that it is the process we have to go through. It was not God's intention originally that we would grieve, but grief is now the process that we use to handle loss, the change of seasons, the change of abilities in our lives. And it's important to recognize that we all experience grief differently. I've been with some people who have managed to move through the stages and make it to acceptance very quickly. Some people spend years processing it. We're all different. And what can happen is we can put the expectation of how we go through the grief process onto other people. And that's not fair. We are all unique, and we all grieve uniquely. So we've spoken about some of these already, but some of the common responses to grief, we saw this with Bing Bong, and I've experienced them in my life, maybe you have too, as I've gone through grief, is silence. Bing Bong, when he is first notified that he's being forgotten, he sees all of the memories being tossed over the edge, he just sits in silence and he doesn't speak. And he also experiences apathy, this numbness, this lack of emotions. And apathy is a protective factor that our body, when we're in shock, it allows us to do the things that we might not normally be able to. It's how when people lose a loved one like a child or a spouse, they're able to process the will and do funeral arrangements and handle, the estate in the beginning. That for days, sometimes weeks, they may be apathetic and they don't feel anything so that they can take care of the things that need to be done. But then we can move into the option of avoidance. There are people that when they lose something, they just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to deal with it because to say it out loud might make it real. And that keeps us from moving into the acceptance phase. We've talked about extreme reactions. And one of the extreme reactions might not just be to spend a whole bunch of money. It might be to do dangerous things, to risky behavior, to do things that might cause self-harm or even to self-harm. Because if you're apathetic long enough, sometimes people find that self-harm gives them a brief window of feeling again. They may feel excited. They may feel adrenaline rushes. They may have dopamine rushes in their brain from that pain. And as they go through the grieving process, they might actually become reliant on pain. And that's not healthy. The goal is to move into healthy processing where we can accept what happened, integrate it into our story, and allow us to be transformed into something else. What's important to recognize is the brain is connected to trauma. And there's two important things we need to understand in the brain. Is that, first of all, we experience emotional pain in the same part of our brain that we experience physical pain. This is why when we go through the grief process, there are physical symptoms. We can be so overcome with grief that we become physically ill, that we experience pains and aches in our bodies and our muscles, that we can have issues with digestion and no appetite. They're manifestations in our body because of the emotions that we're going through. Another thing that can happen as we go through grief is when we feel these strong emotions, our amygdala, which is where our emotions are centered in the brain, can swell. And when it swells within our brain because we're overcome with these strong emotions, it cuts off access to our prefrontal cortex where we do our thinking. Here's an enlarged chart if it helps you see things better, but we recognize that as we are going through these intense emotions, it's harder to think. It's harder to process. It's harder to do that critical reasoning, which is why grief sometimes takes a while for the emotions to subside in order to do the logical work of what is actually going on in the real world. So we've talked about grief and defined it and set its goal, but what are some of the things that we should grieve? What are some of the types of losses there are in life? Well, there are many different kinds, but here's just a short list. The most common one is the loss of a person due to death. That we lose that person, they pass away, and we have to grieve their loss. They're gone. and they're not going to be able to come back. In the Christian faith, we do believe in the resurrection. We do believe there's a time coming where God's going to restore all things to the Edenic perfection it used to be. And at that point, all of our loved ones will be brought back to life in bodily form, and we will reconnect with them again. But in this earthly life, when a person dies, they don't come back. They might get buried, they might be cremated, their ashes may get put in an urn or scattered to the oceans or something like that, but they don't come back. And we have to come to that point of acceptance. Or the loss of a relationship. Maybe it's a divorce, maybe it's an estrangement, maybe it's the loss of a friendship, maybe it's the loss of a connection in our life, such as a job or a career. But what we have to recognize is that when we experience these losses, even if we renew it with something else, or even find reconciliation and restoration with the person who hurt us and we separated from them for a while, once we've lost something, it can never come back exactly the way it was. And one of the things that we have to come to grips with is we can't move forward into a new season of health until we grieve what was lost. Maybe we lose a material object with sentimental value. This is why when house fires happen, the house can be rebuilt. But the things in the house, photos, toys, clothes, furniture, whatever, there are happy memories that are associated with those physical things. And when we lose the thing, we're afraid we might lose the memory. We have a sentimental connection to those items. And if we lose them, we need to grieve them. Maybe the ability to engage in meaningful rituals. When I was overseas with the military in the Middle East, COVID happened. And because of COVID, it was deemed unsafe for people to be able to travel back to the United States for emergency leave. So there were a lot of my soldiers that I worked with that they were unable to go home for funerals when loved ones passed away. And that was very difficult for them to recognize that they would not get to take part in their parents' funeral. Other things we saw during COVID is that high school students weren't able to go to their high school proms or graduations. Maybe, people that get married. One of the things that one of my friends, he and his wife decided to elope, and they just got in their car and drove off on their honeymoon, and they got married at a chapel, and nobody was there but them. And they made that impulsive decision, but later they had to grieve the loss of the big family celebration that many people do with their weddings. Doesn't mean their eloping was wrong, but it means that now that they're married, that celebration is gone. And maybe they could recreate it, but the initial celebration of the marriage is gone, and they had to grieve that loss. Like my grandmother, if we all live long enough, we will lose freedom. We'll lose our autonomy. Our physical body will break down. Our mind might have impairments, and we might lose our ability to do the things we used to do. These are just some of the types of losses. You might have come up with others. But it's important to recognize that we can lose more than just people, and we need to grieve those things. We've talked about the stages of grief, but what I want to remind you is that they don't occur in order, and they vary from person to person, and people move in and out of them. Once again, these are the grief stages that we've talked about. Now, as we look at this, I want to remind you, maybe you've heard this Bible passage before. At Honey Lake Clinic, we provide Christian clinical care for behavioral health treatment. And so we take the Christian perspective, and in that perspective, we recognize that God is ultimately in control, and God has this ability to work all things together for our good. And this is why in Ecclesiastes, and many scholars believe that King Solomon wrote this, he makes this statement: "For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven." That as we live this earthly life, we go through different seasons. There was a season for me to be a teenager. There's a season for me to be a young adult. There's a season for my wife and I to be a newlywed couple. We went through our season of having babies. And now we're right now in our season of teenagers. And it's really tempting many times for me to long for and miss those earlier seasons of life and to want to go back. But what I have to remember, and we all have to remember, is that every season has its purpose. There's a time for everything. There was a time for us to have babies, but we don't have that anymore. Now we have teenagers. And one day, if God gives us that ability, we will have a season, a time for adult children and maybe grandchildren one day. Who knows? But there's a season for everything in life. And we have to make peace with those seasons and stay in sync with them. Otherwise, we experience internal conflict. And in this passage, Solomon writes a bunch of things that there's a time for, and he puts this statement that God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He's made everything beautiful in its own time. That the relationships we had were beautiful in their own time. The people that were in our life. One of the things that's been very difficult as I've transitioned seasons in my life is friends tend to come and go in your seasons. We had friends that were incredibly dear to us, close as family, during our newlywed stage and our young children stage, but they moved away. They got a better job offer on the other side of the country. And as we moved into a new season, that relationship is not what it once was. We still love them and we're still friends with them, but it's not the way it used to be. We're in a different season. Does that mean that season of being newlyweds and young married family couples, families and all that kind of stuff that we shared with them loses its beauty? No. It was beautiful in its own time. And we talked about this before, but Solomon goes on to add, God, he has planted eternity in the human heart. Even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. And there's two important things to note there. First is that we have eternity in our hearts. We recognize that the years we get in this earthly life are not enough. Many years ago when I was a hospital chaplain in a hospital in North Georgia, there was a couple that I was with and the husband was passing away. He was 98 years old. Most of us would agree that's a good long life, far longer than most people live. And his wife was 96 at the time. And his body was breaking down, and he was at that time where because of that he was sleeping most of the time, and we were in the hospital room and she was running her fingers through his hair and singing his songs that he loved to him. They had been married 80 years. They got married when she was 16 and he was 18. 80 years, over 8 decades together. And I was there when he passed away. And as she began to weep and lay her head on his chest, I'll never forget, she looked at me, and with tears in her eyes, she said, it just wasn't enough time. You see, we have eternity in our heart. We long for the eternal. But we have to recognize this other part too. We can't see all of God's work from beginning to end. We're not capable. We're finite. God is infinite. We're limited. And I heard a pastor say that understanding God's work is like trying to explain high-speed internet to an ant. That there are just some things we don't understand, we don't get in this life. And so part of making peace with the grief process is understanding that this life is temporary and eventually things will be put back right. But in the meantime, we don't understand everything. We don't have an answer to every question. And I think that's really important to helping us with the grief process. Speaking of the grief experience, let's add a few more things. Grief is complex. It involves feelings, bodily sensations, and spiritual conflict. One of the greatest conflicts that we deal with is why do bad things happen? And I talk about this more in another class, but to give you the quick version, we have free will. When God created the heavens and the earth, he created it on design laws. And we're familiar with most of these design laws, or many of them at least, the law of gravity, the law of thermodynamics, the laws of logic, right? Laws of force and physics, laws of logic and reasoning. We understand that those laws exist, laws of health. But there are also spiritual laws, and one of those spiritual laws is the law of liberty. And the law of liberty tells us that God created human beings to operate in freedom where love can grow and relationships can be harmonious. The truest and most pure form of love is free love with no conditions. The moment you take someone's freedom away, they either rebel or they destroy their identity. And so because God gave us free will and liberty, we can use that freedom for good or evil. And because we so often use it for evil, bad things happen. When my wife had breast cancer, God didn't give my wife breast cancer, but because of the law of liberty, he didn't stop it either. It was a mutation in her body that developed into a tumor, and it had to be taken out, and treatments had to be done, and procedures had to be made. And so I can get mad at God and say, God, why did you allow this to happen to her? Why didn't you stop it? Or I can recognize that God does not break his own laws. Because once God breaks the law of liberty to prevent evil, where does he stop? If we'd all be real, we think evil thoughts all day long. And we don't let other people hear them. We don't say them out loud, but we think them to ourselves. And guess what? That makes all of us. It makes us all evil. And so my buddy TJ Green, who's a pastor, said this, and it was so good. He said, we say we want God to take the evil out of the world, but what if he begins with you and me? See, that changes things, doesn't it? That different perspective. Once God starts breaking the law of liberty, there's no place for him to stop until he takes away our free will, and then we become robots. And God wanted relationship, not robots. So that's one example of the spiritual conflicts you can experience in grief. We need to recognize there's no set time limit for grief. Grief is a lifetime process. I like to compare it to sandpaper. Sandpaper, the more it works itself across a piece of wood in the beginning, it's rough and it catches a lot of the snags. But as the sandpaper moves back and forth over time, it smooths the rough places out. And it still moves in and out, back and forth, but the process is smoother and easier. That's what happens with grief. The more we process and experience healthy grief, good grief, we are able to move in and out of those phases more smoothly and more healthily. There is no linear process. There's no start and finish. We've talked about that already. Grief doesn't happen in neat stages, but we have to recognize that it needs to happen. There are people that force themselves to not grieve. They distract themselves. They do it with substances, alcohol and drugs. They do it with busyness. They fill their schedule so full that they have no space to grieve. There's a beautiful process in the Jewish faith called sitting Shiva. And when a person dies, their family members will put on burlap and sit in a pile of ashes and cover themselves with ashes, and they will sit in their sorrow. And it's a physical ritual that they go through to bring the body and the mind and the spirit together to go into the grieving process. And they sit in their emotions the same way they sit in those ashes, and they experience grief. Therapy can help with normal grief as well as complicated grief. Therapy can help us come to terms with reality and begin the admission process. There's a passage in John chapter 11 that many of us are familiar with, that one of Jesus' friends, Lazarus, has died. And it goes like this. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, that's where Lazarus lived, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Mary and Martha in their loss. Mary and Martha were Lazarus' sisters. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "If only you had been here, my brother would not have died." This is another spiritual conflict. I know we've already talked about the law of liberty, but this is an echo of it. We say, God, if only you would have shown up, this loss would not have happened. And look at what Jesus asks. Where have you put him? He asked them. They told him, Lord, come and see. And then Jesus wept. What we recognize in this passage is that even God, Jesus, fully God and fully man, experienced grief for the loss of his friends. Jesus, God in skin, knowing what waited on the other side of eternity for Lazarus, still wept. And that lets us know God's heart for us. So if you're tempted to believe, like Mary and Martha did, in a passage, I skipped over part of that passage, Martha and Mary both asked Jesus the same question. They make the same statement. And Jesus gives them the promise that he is the resurrection and the life. And knowing that eternity was still waiting for Lazarus, Jesus still grieved the loss. And we need to recognize that God in this moment is showing us his hurt to show us his heart for us. That God doesn't want sadness and death. It's the result of our free will that has led to evil. But we can rest in the hope that while we grieve now, one day everything will be made right. So how do we grieve in a healthy way? How do we cope with this grief? Well, like I've mentioned before, the first step is acceptance. The first step is acceptance. We have to accept the reality of the loss. We've got to move out of denial and into acceptance. Once we accept the loss, we can acknowledge it and make space for the pain, make space for the sadness, make space for the anger and all the other stages and feelings. Then we move into adjusting. Our life is going to be different now that that has been lost. Whether it's a person, a season, a relationship, we have to adjust. And then we have to find ways to remember what was lost while still moving forward. I'll give you an example that my mother-in-law was an educator for over 40 years. She was most of that time a college professor. And after she retired, it was fun for about 6 months. But after the new wore off, she began to recognize how much she missed being a teacher. So much of her identity was tied up in that job, that career. She was Professor Littlefield, and that was who she was. Who is she without it? And she had to go through these stages. She had to accept that that season was over. She's retired. It was beautiful, but it's gone. And then she had to acknowledge that she had built so much of her identity on her career, and now that that was over, she has to discover herself again and create a new identity. She has to adjust. What is life like now that I don't have to get up every morning and go to school and write lesson plans and grade papers and go to teaching conferences? What is my life now? I have to adjust. And then she had to find a way to do this, and she did a ritual. And we might not think of it as a ritual, but she had a retirement party where she invited her friends and her family, and we celebrated her 40 years of educational work that she did to pour into the lives of others. And that ritual allowed her to remember what was lost, that this career is over, but now she can move forward into retirement and look for the new. That's healthy. Unhealthy is pretty much the opposite. That we, instead of accepting, we deny the loss. Instead of acknowledging it, we engage in activities that distract us. Instead of moving forward in life, we refuse to make any changes. We don't adjust. And so as a result, we avoid all reminders and we stay stuck in that loss. And so we have to recognize that you cannot get away from truth. You can only delay when you confront it. Guilt and distraction can keep us from going through the grief process, but it doesn't keep us from doing it forever. It's only a distraction. It only deters the truth. Eventually it will catch up to us. The sooner we go through the process and quit doing unhealthy coping, the sooner we can go through it in a healthy way and move forward into a new season of life. So what are some ways that we can process our grief? Well, first we need to maybe create a special place in our home. Maybe it becomes a memorial area with photos and trinkets and knickknacks to remind us of that person. Maybe we engage in that ritual like my mother-in-law did of her retirement party. Maybe we write a letter to that person, to ourselves, to God that we don't send. Maybe we journal and we write down about our experiences and we reflect on them over time and go back and look at our process. Just writing things down helps us process. Be mindful that we are in grief and give ourselves grace. One of the things that I found helpful that I stole from a therapist, and I've been able to share it when I provide pastoral care, is she encouraged her clients to set parameters and say, for an hour today, I'm going to go into my room, I'm going to get out the photos of the person that I lost, that I'm grieving their loss, and I'm only going to let myself do it for an hour. And I'm just going to let the emotions go, and I'm going to cry, and I'm going to scream, and if I'm angry, and I'm going to look back over all these things, and I'm going to sit in that feeling and set a 1-hour timer. And once that hour's up, I'm going to put it all away, and I'm going to go back to life. But by giving those parameters, it keeps us from just wallowing in misery. Be mindful and make space. What if you've got a friend or a loved one that is grieving? Maybe you're not going through grief, but how can you help them? Number one, allow them to experience a full range of emotions. Don't try to push them back into happiness again. Allow them to be sad. Allow them to be angry. Allow them to be fearful of the future. Experience the emotions so that they can say, what is this emotion telling me? Now what do I want to do with it? And then we got to be patient in the process. Grief is not a light switch that you flip on and off. They say, oh, I'm grieving. Oh, I'm done. It takes time. You have to be understanding of it. It's okay for you to talk about the memories with them. Share the stories of that lost person or that lost season, that lost ability. One of the things that is incredibly powerful is to sit down with somebody and share the good times that you've been through with them, and let them acknowledge the beauty of the time they had with that person or that season of life. As your friend, you can remember that you need to let them have the time. It takes time to grieve, and one of the best things you can do is to be an active listener, to just sit there and listen to them as they go through it. That's how you can help them. As we get ready to close, I want to share this quote from one of my favorite poets and favorite poems by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She says this: "Earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around it and pluck blackberries." Now, there's a lot of application points we can take from this poem, but what I want you to recognize is that the earth is full of heaven. Everywhere we look, every experience we go through is a moment to encounter God. And Elizabeth Browning makes this connection to the burning bush. Or when Moses met with God at the burning bush, he took the sandals off his feet and spent time with God in veneration and worship because he was on holy ground. But other people don't see that bush as holy ground. They're so busy with life. They're plucking blackberries. They're doing the work of life that they miss that opportunity to experience God. Grief is one of those moments where we experience God. Don't distract yourself from it. Don't cover yourself up with busyness or substances or compound the grief that refuses to go through it. Don't live in denial. Recognize this is a moment to meet with God, go through the grieving process to make peace with the past and clear out space in our hearts, minds, and spirits to move into what can be in the present and future. Here's the sources from where I got this material from. Use it if you need more information. And of course, if you have questions, you can send me an email, give me a phone call, or shoot me a text message. I'm glad to help any way I can. Thank you for joining us for this lesson. I pray God richly blesses you and that this material helps you in your life.